It was a bright morning when a young black woman quietly entered the small-town police station. She wore a simple outfit, jeans and a plain shirt, and carried no badge on display, no sign of her authority. To anyone watching, she looked like just another citizen. But her eyes told a different story. They were calm, sharp, and quietly observant, taking in every corner of the room as if she was studying the environment carefully. The station itself was not very busy that day. A few officers sat at their desks, some flipping through files, others chatting idly. The air carried the scent of old coffee and paper. In one corner, a tall officer leaned back in his chair with an air of arrogance. He had a loud voice, the kind that demanded attention even when he wasn't saying much. He was known among his colleagues for his proud and careless attitude, but no one ever dared challenge him openly. When his eyes fell on the young woman who had just stepped inside, his face twisted into a mocking smile. He didn't ask who she was. He didn't offer a polite greeting like an officer of the law should. Instead, he chuckled softly and nudged the officer sitting beside him, as if he had found something amusing. The young woman walked calmly across the room, not in a hurry, not intimidated by the sudden attention she was receiving. She glanced at the bulletin board with notices and community flyers, then at the desks cluttered with paperwork. Her silence seemed to annoy the officer even more. "Hey," he called out loudly, his tone carrying no respect. "You lost or something?" The room grew a little quieter. A couple of officers looked up from their desks, curious about what was happening. The young woman didn't answer right away. She simply looked at him, her calm expression steady, almost unreadable. The officer smirked. He picked up a cup of water from his desk. Without warning, and in front of everyone, he stood up, walked over to her, and with an exaggerated motion, tilted the cup and poured the water right over her head. A cold silence filled the room instantly. The water trickled down her hair and onto her shirt, soaking through the fabric. Drops splashed onto the floor. The officer laughed loudly, his voice echoing in the room. "There you go," he said mockingly, as if he had done something clever. Some of the officers froze in their seats, their faces filled with shock. Others shifted uncomfortably, glancing at one another, unsure whether to intervene or remain quiet. No one dared to say anything out loud, but the tension was unmistakable. The young woman, however, did not flinch. She did not yell, she did not cry, and she did not strike back. Instead, she calmly lifted her hand, brushed some of the water away from her face, and looked straight at the officer. Her eyes held no fear, only a quiet strength that unsettled him for a brief second. The room seemed to hold its breath. She then reached into her small bag and pulled out a handkerchief, dabbing her face gently as if nothing had happened. Her steady composure confused the officer. He had expected anger, maybe tears, or at least an argument. Instead, she showed dignity, and that made his cruel attempt at humor fall flat. "Don't just stand there," the officer muttered, trying to cover his unease with another laugh. "Say something. You're in the wrong place." The young woman didn't answer him. She simply continued to wipe her face, her silence speaking louder than any words could. A younger officer sitting at a desk nearby clenched his fists under the table. He wanted to speak up, but fear of going against his colleague kept him still. Another officer shifted in his chair and cleared his throat nervously, but even he stayed quiet. Everyone seemed trapped between what was right and what was safe for them to do. The arrogant officer, seeing that no one was stopping him, grew bolder. "Next time," he said loudly, so the whole room could hear, "maybe you should think twice before walking in here like you own the place." Still, the young woman remained composed. She gave him a small, almost knowing smile. It wasn't a smile of weakness, it was one of patience, the kind of smile that carried a hidden strength. Her calmness made the officer uncomfortable in a way he couldn't explain. For the first time, he felt a flicker of doubt, though he quickly brushed it aside. He believed he had control over the room, and no one would challenge him. But what he didn't know was that the quiet woman standing before him was not just another visitor. She was about to become his superior, the very person who would decide the future of the station he thought he controlled. For now, though, she stayed silent. She allowed him to reveal himself fully in front of everyone. She allowed his arrogance and disrespect to shine so brightly that no one in that room could ever deny it later. The atmosphere in the room was heavy. Every tick of the wall clock seemed louder than usual. The officers sat frozen in their chairs, unsure how this moment would end. The young woman finally folded her handkerchief neatly, placed it back in her bag, and took a step forward. Her posture was straight, her eyes unwavering. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't show anger. Instead, she carried herself with quiet confidence, as if she knew something no one else in the room did. The officer sneered again, but his laugh didn't carry the same confidence it had a few moments earlier. Something about her calm gaze unsettled him. Still, he puffed out his chest and said, "This isn't your place. You better leave before you cause more trouble." The young woman simply stood there, her silence more powerful than any argument. She was waiting. Waiting for the right moment to reveal the truth. And though the officer didn't realize it yet, that moment was coming sooner than he could ever imagine. The room, filled with tension, seemed suspended in time. Every officer knew something had shifted. The act that was meant to humiliate had only revealed the arrogance and cruelty of one man, while the dignity of the woman stood unshaken. The station remained silent after the shocking scene. The sound of dripping water from the woman's shirt hitting the floor was the only noise in the room. The arrogant officer sat back in his chair again, pretending to be proud of himself, but deep down he felt a strange unease. He couldn't explain why the young woman's calmness unsettled him. He had expected her to protest loudly or storm out angrily, but she had done neither. Her quiet composure seemed to carry more strength than any harsh reply ever could. The other officers avoided eye contact with her. Some were embarrassed, others nervous. A few of them shifted in their chairs, wishing they could rewind the last few minutes and erase the shameful act they had just witnessed. But no one moved. They had seen moments like this before, moments when arrogance triumphed over fairness, and they had learned to stay silent for their own safety. The young woman stood still for a while, letting the silence linger. She could feel every pair of eyes on her. Yet she didn't allow the humiliation to break her spirit. She knew she had come here for a reason, and what had just happened was only revealing the truth she needed to see. Finally, she spoke softly, her voice steady. "Is this how you welcome every visitor who walks through your door?" Her words, though calm, carried a weight that made the arrogant officer's smile falter for a second. He quickly regained his smirk and shrugged. "Only the ones who look like they don't belong." The answer confirmed everything she had already suspected. She had heard whispers about the culture in this police station, about the arrogance, the bias, and the lack of respect shown to certain people. But hearing it spoken so openly in front of everyone only strengthened her resolve. The woman took a slow breath. She did not want to reveal her identity yet. She wanted to see more, to test how far the officer would go, and to observe how the others would react. So, she simply replied, "Interesting." Then she turned her gaze toward the bulletin board again, as if she was still just an ordinary visitor. The arrogant officer leaned forward, irritated by her calmness. "Interesting? That's all you have to say?" he asked, raising his voice. "You think you can just stroll in here, dripping water all over the place, and act like you're in charge?" She turned her head and looked at him directly. "I don't have to act like I'm in charge," she said quietly, her tone so confident that it made a few of the other officers exchange uneasy glances. The officer frowned. He didn't know why, but her words rattled him. He laughed nervously and tried to shake off the strange feeling. "You're in the wrong place, lady," he said louder. Why don't you just leave before you cause more problems? But the woman didn't move. Instead, she walked slowly across the room, her footsteps calm and deliberate. She stopped near one of the desks and looked down at the papers spread across it. The officer sitting there froze, unsure whether he should tell her to step back or let her be. She studied the documents carefully, then nodded slightly, as though she was taking note of how the station operated. Her quiet inspection made the arrogant officer even more restless. "Hey," he barked. "I said you need to leave." The woman looked up at him again. "Why are you so afraid of me looking around?" she asked simply. The question hit him unexpectedly. He opened his mouth to reply but found no words. His face turned red with frustration, and he waved his hand dismissively. "Afraid? Don't flatter yourself. I just don't like strangers poking around where they don't belong." Her eyes narrowed ever so slightly, but her voice remained calm. "Strangers often see the truth that those inside choose to ignore." The other officers shifted uncomfortably again. They knew her words carried meaning. They had seen unfair behavior in the station before, and they had stayed silent each time. Hearing her speak so calmly and directly made them feel exposed. The arrogant officer scoffed, trying to regain control. "Lady, you've got a big mouth for someone standing in wet clothes. You should think about your place." But the young woman's place was not what he imagined. She adjusted her shirt slightly, still damp from the water, and walked toward an empty chair in the corner. Without asking permission, she sat down, her back straight, her eyes fixed calmly on the officer. Her silent defiance made him more unsettled than if she had shouted. The room seemed to hold its breath again. Every officer was now watching, waiting to see what would happen next. Minutes passed in tense silence until the door at the far end of the station opened. A senior officer walked in, holding a folder in his hands. His eyes immediately lit up when he saw the young woman sitting in the chair. He smiled warmly and walked straight to her. "Chief," he said respectfully, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Welcome. We weren't expecting you until later." The word chief echoed in the room like a thunderclap. Every officer froze, eyes wide with shock. The arrogant officer's mouth dropped open, his face draining of color. The young woman finally stood, her presence commanding the room. She looked at the senior officer and nodded politely. "Thank you," she said. "I thought I'd come a little earlier. I wanted to see the station as it really is, without preparation." The silence that followed was heavy. Every officer understood what she meant. She had walked in unannounced to see the truth of their culture, and the truth had revealed itself in the cruelest way possible. The arrogant officer stammered, "See, Chief?" "Wait, you mean, she's..." The senior officer turned sharply toward him, his expression stern. "Yes. She is our new police chief. And from what I see, she's already been given quite a revealing welcome." Gasps filled the air. The officers exchanged uneasy looks, some ashamed, some nervous about what would happen next. The arrogant officer felt his legs weaken as the reality sank in. He had poured water over the head of the very person who now had the highest authority in the building. The young chief turned her gaze back to him, calm but unyielding. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The strength in her silence was more powerful than any words of anger. She finally spoke. "It's good to know where the real problems are, right from the start." Her words made the officer shrink back, his arrogance crumbling. The other officers lowered their heads, ashamed. They knew that the station's days of careless behavior and unchecked arrogance were about to change. The air inside the police station felt heavy, almost like the walls themselves were holding their breath. Every officer in the room stood frozen after hearing the senior officer's words. The arrogant cop who had poured water over the young woman's head felt his chest tighten. His earlier pride had vanished, replaced with disbelief and fear. He glanced at his colleagues, searching for support, but none of them dared meet his eyes. Their faces were a mix of shock, embarrassment, and nervous curiosity. Each of them realized the same thing at the same time: the young woman who had walked in so quietly, the one they had assumed was just a stranger, was in fact their new leader. The chief straightened her posture and looked around the room. Her calm gaze moved slowly from one officer to another. She did not need to raise her voice to command attention, her presence was enough. The strength in her silence made every officer feel exposed, as though she could see straight through them. Finally, she turned her attention back to the arrogant cop. He shifted uneasily, his usual smirk nowhere to be found. He tried to speak, but his words tangled in his throat. "Chief. I didn't know. I mean, it was just..." The chief raised her hand gently, stopping him mid-sentence. "You didn't know," she repeated softly, her tone calm but cutting. "But even if you didn't know who I was, does that excuse your behavior?" The room fell silent again. The officer's mouth opened and closed, but no answer came out. His mind raced for an excuse, but deep down, he knew there wasn't one. She didn't press him further. Instead, she turned her gaze to the others. "And the rest of you," she said, her voice still even, "you watched it happen. Not one of you stepped forward. Not one of you said a word." Several officers lowered their heads, ashamed. A younger officer who had wanted to speak earlier clenched his fists under the desk. He felt both guilty and relieved that the chief had noticed everything. The senior officer holding the folder cleared his throat, unsure whether he should step in, but the chief gave him a small nod that told him she had the situation under control. She took a slow step forward, her shoes tapping lightly against the floor. "Respect," she said, her voice steady. "Respect is the foundation of this job. If we cannot show respect to the people who walk through these doors, then how can we expect the community to respect us?" Her words cut deep. A few officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their faces growing red with embarrassment. They all knew she was right. The truth was being laid bare in front of them, and there was no way to hide it. The arrogant cop swallowed hard. His earlier boldness had vanished completely. He tried once again to explain himself. "Chief, it was just a joke. I didn't mean anything by it." The chief turned her eyes back to him, calm but firm. "A joke at someone else's expense is not a joke," she replied. "It is disrespect. And disrespect has no place in this uniform." Her words struck him like a hammer. He had always used humor as a shield, a way to cover up his behavior. But in front of her, that excuse felt weak and meaningless. She stepped closer, standing only a few feet away from him now. "Do you think pouring water on a visitor is funny? Do you think mocking someone based on your own assumptions is what this badge stands for?" The officer lowered his head, unable to answer. The chief let the silence hang for a moment, making sure her words sank in. Then she turned back to the rest of the room. "I came here unannounced because I wanted to see the station for what it really is. I didn't want a polished welcome. I didn't want rehearsed words. I wanted the truth." And the truth revealed itself very quickly. Her eyes moved across the room again, pausing on each officer. Some looked ashamed, some nervous, and a few appeared quietly hopeful. They could sense that change was coming. The chief walked toward the senior officer and took the folder from his hands. She flipped it open and glanced at the papers inside. "There are reports here," she said, lifting the pages slightly, "about this department's culture. Reports about arrogance, carelessness, and lack of discipline. I wanted to see if those reports were accurate. And now, I have my answer." The weight of her words made the room feel colder. The officers shifted uncomfortably, each one wondering how much she had already discovered. The arrogant cop finally looked up, his face pale. "Chief, please," he stammered. "It won't happen again. I swear." "I didn't know." The chief raised her hand again, silencing him. "You didn't need to know who I was to do the right thing," she said firmly. "Respect is not about rank. It's not about who stands in front of you. It's about treating every person with dignity, no matter who they are." Her words echoed in the room, and for the first time, some of the officers felt a sense of relief. It was as if someone had finally spoken the truth they had been afraid to voice for years. The chief closed the folder and placed it on the desk. She looked at the group once more. "From this day forward," she said clearly, "this department will not run on arrogance. It will not run on fear. It will run on respect, accountability, and service to the people we are sworn to protect." A murmur ran through the room. Some officers straightened their posture, inspired by her words. Others looked uneasy, knowing that the days of hiding behind bad habits were coming to an end. The arrogant officer stood frozen, his mind racing. He wanted to defend himself, but every excuse he thought of seemed weak under her gaze. For the first time in his career, he realized that his behavior had consequences, real consequences that he could no longer laugh away. The chief stepped back slightly, her calmness still unbroken. "This is not about one moment," she said softly. "It's about a culture. And culture must change if we want to be worthy of the badge we wear." Her words settled deep into every heart in the room. The revelation of who she was had already shaken them, but her strength, patience, and fairness made an even greater impact. The arrogant officer finally lowered his head completely, unable to look at her. He knew that his career, and perhaps his reputation, would never be the same again. And as the room sat in silence, one thing became clear to everyone present: a new era had just begun inside that station. The station remained tense after the revelation. The officers were still processing the fact that the quiet young woman they had dismissed as a stranger was actually their new police chief. The silence felt endless until she finally spoke again. Her voice was calm, but her words carried a weight that pressed down on every person in the room. "Every action has consequences," she began, her eyes sweeping across the room. "What I witnessed today is not a small mistake. It is a reflection of something deeper, something that cannot be ignored." The arrogant officer who had poured water on her shifted uncomfortably. His confidence was gone, replaced by unease and fear. He had spent years believing he could act however he pleased without consequences. But today, for the first time, he realized that those days might be over. The chief stepped closer to the center of the room, standing tall. "Accountability begins here," she continued. "We cannot expect the public to trust us if we do not hold ourselves to the highest standards. Respect, discipline, and fairness must live within these walls first." The younger officer who had wanted to speak earlier finally found the courage to raise his head. He admired her composure and strength. He could see she was not just here to carry a title, she was here to bring real change. The chief turned her gaze back to the arrogant officer. "Your actions today were unacceptable," she said firmly. "You chose humiliation instead of respect. You chose arrogance instead of professionalism. That is not what this uniform represents." The officer swallowed hard. His lips trembled as he tried to form a reply. "Chief, I made a mistake. It won't happen again." Her eyes stayed on him, steady and calm. "You're right about one thing, it won't happen again. But not because you say so. It won't happen again because there will be consequences." The words struck him deeply. He felt his knees weaken, and sweat formed on his forehead. For years, he had avoided discipline. He had laughed off complaints, and his behavior had often been excused. But now, things were different. The chief didn't shout, didn't show anger. Her calm tone made her words even more powerful. "Effective immediately," she said, "you will be suspended while an internal review is conducted. Your actions will not be brushed aside. They will be examined, and the consequences will follow." Gasps filled the room. Several officers looked at each other in surprise. They had never seen one of their own held accountable so quickly and so firmly. Some felt nervous, wondering if their own actions would soon come under review. Others felt relief, as though a heavy shadow was finally being lifted. The arrogant officer's mouth opened, but no words came out. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but deep inside he knew she was right. For the first time, he had no shield, no excuse, no way out. His arrogance crumbled, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. The chief turned back to the rest of the room. "And to the rest of you," she said evenly, "silence is not neutral. When you see wrong and say nothing, you become part of it. Every one of you had a chance to stop what happened today, but you chose not to. That cannot continue." Her words stung. The officers lowered their heads, ashamed. Some of them felt guilt pressing heavily on their hearts. They knew she was telling the truth. She softened her tone slightly, though her firmness remained. "I am not here to punish all of you. I am here to rebuild trust. That will not happen overnight, but it will happen if each of us chooses to do what is right. That begins now." The senior officer who had greeted her nodded, admiration shining in his eyes. He had served under many leaders, but none had commanded respect so effortlessly. The chief took a deep breath before continuing. "From this day forward, there will be clear standards. There will be training on respect, fairness, and accountability. No one, no matter their rank or years of service, will be above those standards. If you cannot accept that, then this department is not the place for you." A murmur spread quietly through the room. Some officers looked inspired, straightening their posture as though ready for the challenge. Others looked uneasy, realizing the careless days were over. The chief looked directly at one of the younger officers. "You wanted to speak earlier, didn't you?" she asked gently. He froze, surprised that she had noticed. Slowly, he nodded. "Yes, Chief," he admitted quietly. She gave him a small, encouraging smile. "Remember that feeling," she said. "The next time you see something wrong, don't hold back. Speak. Because silence protects the wrong and silences the right. And I will support those who choose courage." The young officer felt a rush of relief. For the first time in his career, he felt like he could stand for what was right without fear of being crushed by those above him. The chief returned her focus to the group as a whole. Discipline is not just about punishment. It is about growth. It is about learning from mistakes and building something better. But growth cannot begin until we face the truth. The officers listened carefully, the weight of her words sinking in. Many of them had been frustrated for years, watching arrogance and disrespect go unchallenged. Now, they felt hope flicker in their hearts. The arrogant officer, however, stood still, his head lowered. He knew his career was in danger. His pride had vanished completely. The chief turned back to him one final time. "You will step away for now," she said. "The review will decide your future here. But understand this: respect is not optional. It is the foundation of everything we do." Her words left no room for argument. The officer gave a small, defeated nod. His arrogance had finally met a wall it could not climb. The chief then addressed the entire room once more. "This department will not be rebuilt overnight," she said. "But it will be rebuilt. And each of you will decide whether you want to be part of that change. I will not tolerate disrespect, but I will support growth. The choice is yours." A sense of clarity settled in the room. The officers finally understood that a new era had begun. The silence that had once allowed arrogance to thrive would no longer be enough. Accountability had arrived, and with it, the possibility of true transformation. The chief took one last look around the room. Her gaze was steady, her posture strong. Without raising her voice, she had changed the entire atmosphere of the station. She had turned a moment of humiliation into a turning point, not just for herself but for everyone present. As she walked toward her new office, the sound of her footsteps echoed with purpose. Each step was a reminder that leadership is not about power, it is about integrity, respect, and the courage to stand firm when it matters most. After the events of that day, the police station slowly began to change. The once tense and uneasy atmosphere started to feel lighter, more focused, and more respectful. Officers who had spent years coasting through routines without thought now realized that their actions mattered. They understood that respect, accountability, and professionalism were not just words, they were the foundation of every interaction, both within the department and with the community they served. The chief wasted no time in putting her plans into motion. She called meetings, one-on-one sessions, and training programs designed not just to teach procedures but to teach character. She believed that leadership was not about punishment alone, it was about nurturing integrity and creating an environment where everyone felt responsible for doing the right thing. Every morning, she walked through the halls, greeting officers by name, asking about their work, and listening carefully to their concerns. The officers noticed something different about her approach. She was firm, yes, but also genuinely caring. She expected excellence, but she also supported growth. Mistakes were no longer ignored, but they were also treated as opportunities to learn. The officer who had poured water on her head was still suspended, and his internal review was ongoing. The other officers watched closely, realizing that no one was above accountability, no matter their rank or tenure. Slowly, respect replaced fear. Officers began to correct each other politely when they noticed mistakes, and they supported each other more openly. The young officer who had earlier wanted to speak up found new confidence. Encouraged by the chief's words, he began volunteering for community outreach programs. He spent time talking to local teenagers about safety, responsibility, and the importance of honesty. His example inspired others in the department to become more engaged with the community beyond the station walls. The chief also implemented regular workshops on bias awareness, conflict resolution, and professional ethics. These sessions were not lectures, they were interactive, honest, and sometimes challenging. Officers were encouraged to share their experiences, admit past mistakes, and learn from each other. Over time, even the most skeptical officers began to see the value in these sessions. One day, a community meeting was held in the local recreation center. Citizens who had once criticized the police were invited to speak directly with the department. The chief began the meeting by acknowledging past mistakes. She admitted that there had been times when officers acted without proper thought or respect, and she promised that change was underway. The community members were surprised but appreciative. They saw that the new chief was sincere, approachable, and committed to making things right. Questions were asked, concerns were voiced, and for the first time in a long time, the officers listened not as authority figures, but as partners in the community's safety. As months passed, the department's reputation began to improve. Complaints decreased, and citizens started noticing the difference. Officers who once treated the public with indifference now greeted people with respect and patience. They were more attentive to their duties, understanding that their behavior reflected not just on themselves but on the entire department. The chief also made it a priority to recognize good work. Officers who demonstrated courage, kindness, and professionalism were publicly acknowledged. This recognition was not about showing favoritism but about reinforcing positive behavior. Slowly, a culture of excellence began to take root, one that valued integrity over arrogance and teamwork over individual ego. The officer who had humiliated the chief eventually returned after the review. His reinstatement came with strict conditions. He had to undergo additional training, demonstrate accountability in his daily work, and participate in mentorship programs. He entered the station cautiously, aware of the eyes upon him. The first few days were difficult, colleagues watched closely, remembering the incident. But over time, he showed genuine effort to improve. His behavior changed, not out of fear, but out of understanding that respect was the standard now. not the exception. The young officer continued to thrive under the chief's guidance. He was given leadership responsibilities, helping organize training sessions and community initiatives. He began mentoring new recruits, teaching them not just the rules of the job but the importance of character and integrity. His growth was a clear example of how positive change could ripple through a department when guided by strong, ethical leadership. The chief did not stop at internal reform. She worked with local schools, community centers, and organizations to foster trust between the police and the people they served. Programs were created to help students learn about law enforcement, safety, and civic responsibility. Community members began attending ride-alongs and open house events, gaining insight into the challenges and responsibilities of the officers. The transformation was not instantaneous, nor was it easy. Some officers struggled to adapt to the new expectations. There were disagreements, debates, and moments of tension. But the chief handled these with patience and firmness, always emphasizing learning and growth rather than punishment alone. She believed that a department built on fear might obey orders, but a department built on respect would thrive. Months turned into a year, and the changes became visible to everyone. The station was no longer just a building where rules were enforced, it became a place of learning, accountability, and community partnership. Officers walked with pride, citizens walked with trust, and the chief walked with a quiet confidence, knowing that her efforts were making a lasting difference. One afternoon, as the chief walked through the precinct, she noticed a group of officers laughing and sharing stories, not in arrogance, but in camaraderie. The young officer who had once hesitated to speak now led part of the conversation, his confidence shining. Even the officer who had once humiliated her offered a respectful nod as she passed, a small but significant sign of change. The chief paused and reflected. Leadership was not about proving power in a single moment. It was about consistency, fairness, and courage over time. The water poured on her head had been an act of disrespect, but it had also been a moment that revealed what needed to change. And she had changed it? Not with anger or vengeance, but with patience, wisdom, and unwavering commitment to integrity. Word of the department's transformation began to spread to neighboring areas. Other police stations reached out for advice and guidance, curious about how a department could turn around so quickly and effectively. The chief was invited to speak at conferences, sharing her experiences and emphasizing the importance of accountability, leadership, and community engagement. She often reminded herself that the work was never truly finished. Leadership was a journey, not a destination. Every day brought new challenges, new opportunities, and new lessons. But she also knew that the foundation she had built, the foundation of respect, accountability, and integrity, was strong enough to support the growth and evolution of the department for years to come. One evening, after a long day of meetings and community outreach, the chief walked outside and watched the sunset. She thought about how far things had come. She thought about the young officer finding his voice, the arrogant officer learning humility, and the entire department beginning to operate as a unified team. Most of all, she thought about the community they served, now seeing law enforcement as partners rather than distant authority figures. A smile touched her face. Change was never easy, but it was always worth it. Every step of the journey mattered, every moment of courage counted, and every act of integrity built a stronger, safer, and more trusting community. In the end, the incident that had started as a moment of humiliation had become a turning point, a moment that sparked transformation, accountability, and hope. The chief had not just taken her rightful place in the department, she had reshaped it, leaving a legacy of respect, courage, and leadership that would endure for generations. The officers, once hesitant and unsure, now worked together with purpose. The community, once skeptical, now smiled and waved as officers patrolled their streets. And the chief, the woman who had faced humiliation and doubt, now stood as a symbol of strength, integrity, and unwavering commitment to justice. It was not a story about revenge or anger. It was a story about courage, transformation, and the power of one person to inspire change. And from that day forward, everyone in the department and the community knew, true leadership is measured not by titles or authority, but by the positive change one creates in the lives of others.